This is the story about how you were lied to, with billions of dollars being spent to confuse you about renewable energy.
So today we're looking at this video from AsapSCIENCE, which talks about lies we've all been apparently told about renewable energy. The reason I want to talk about this video in particular is because it tends to be very misleading. It's not wrong per se. From what I can tell, the facts that they present are fairly accurate, but it's one of those videos where they only present all the facts on one side of the debate and omit very crucial facts on the other side. Basically, it's a lie by omission, where you're not technically saying anything false, but you're also failing to give the entire truth.
Many people don't want you to know this, but you are in fact living through a third industrial revolution.
So right off the bat, I find this framing of the issue to be very bizarre. Many people don't want you to know this, but you're currently living through a third industrial revolution. Okay, who are these many people and why do they want to keep that a secret? I mean, the fact that we live in an era of technological prosperity is hardly a secret, considering most people carry around pocket computers that can communicate across the globe instantly.
The new way of communicating is the internet. The new way of getting around is hybrid and electric vehicles.
The electric car goes back to the early 1880s. It's hardly a new technology.
And the new power source is solar, wind, and nuclear.
Solar and wind are some of the first energy sources to ever be utilized by human civilization. As for nuclear power, that technology goes back to World War I. So yeah, again, these are hardly new technologies.
But since 2016, the top 5 oil companies have spent $1 billion trying to confuse everybody about these new power sources.
Now that's a bit of a bold claim. Where does this whole $1 billion figure come from? And how exactly are they trying to mislead people? Not only do they not elaborate on this point at all, but I actually went through the list of sources they have in the description and couldn't find any figure for how much oil companies spend trying to mislead people on renewable energy. By the way, I just want to state for the record that half of their sources are book advertisements and the other half are behind a paywall.
And it kind of makes sense because in the last 10 years, they made $900 billion of profit.
This figure is misleading because they want you to assume that all $900 billion of that profit came from oil, and that none of it came from low-carbon alternatives such as natural gas or renewables. After all, oil isn't the only thing that energy companies invest in.
In 2019, they only spent 3% of their $115 billion capital investment in low-carbon alternatives.
So once again, I have no idea where this figure is coming from because I couldn't find it cited in any of their sources. But anyways, this figure is misleading for several reasons. First of all, they don't define what is a low-carbon alternative. Obviously, they're probably referring to renewables, but low-carbon alternatives could also refer to things like natural gas or biofuels. And even if we do assume that this figure is accurate, 3% of $150 billion is still a lot of money. I was curious to see for myself how exactly it is that big energy companies are investing in lower carbon alternatives. I did some research and I'll put some links to some sources in the description.
They suggest that a power grid based off of renewables isn't feasible or is too expensive or would hurt the economy.
So first of all, you're conflating renewables and low carbon alternatives. Those aren't necessarily the same thing. As I mentioned before, natural gas is a lower carbon alternative to oil, but it's not necessarily renewable. But second of all, and more importantly, if it really were the case that renewable energy was a scam or a waste of money or whatever, then why do these big energy companies invest so much money into it? According to your own figures that you cite, these companies invest 3% of $150 billion into low carbon alternatives. That equates to $45 million being spent on something that apparently has no future. If this is really true, shouldn't that number be zero?
But what if I told you that as of November 2018, everything changed?
Did the laws of physics magically change, such that wind and solar are now suddenly more efficient than fossil fuels? Somehow I doubt that.
This is the moment when renewable energy such as wind and solar became cheaper and more efficient than fossil fuels.
Another big problem I have with this video is that they seem to choose to only focus on wind and solar for some reason. I mean, why? You do realize that wind and solar aren't the only sources of renewable energy. There's also hydroelectric, geothermal, and biofuels, a lot of which are cheaper and more efficient than solar and wind.
For example, in 1977, the cost of photovoltaic cells for solar panels was $76. Now, it's only 50 cents.
So one thing that they don't mention is that a big reason for this price decrease isn't necessarily because the technology is becoming cheaper or more efficient. A lot of it is from government subsidies. You know, the government steals money from one sector of the economy and gives it to another to make it seem more profitable and efficient than it actually is.
This is all while fossil fuel energies have reached their peak efficiency. Chemical engineers and scientists agree that fossil fuels have matured with little potential left to exploit, whereas wind and solar continue to become more efficient each year. Sorry bud, you're old.
While it is true that the technologies surrounding wind and solar power have become more efficient over the years, they're not magic. Wind and solar have their own efficiency limitations. Now, the exact physics behind this is a bit complicated. If you're curious to know more, I put a link to some sources in the description.
Now, the sun emits 470 exajoules of energy to Earth every 88 minutes, which is the amount of energy that all of us combined use in 1 year. If we grabbed 1/100th of the energy that the sun emits, it would give us 6 times the energy we now use across the global economy.
While it is certainly true that the sun bathes the Earth in copious amounts of energy, actually capturing and harnessing that energy poses some technological challenges. In addition to the efficiency limitation of solar panels that I mentioned previously, there's also the issue of, for example, what do you do at nighttime, or what do you do when the weather's not that good? Obviously, you're going to need to implement some type of storage technology. This could include batteries or pumped hydroelectric storage, but those technologies have their limitations too, as we'll get into.
If wind farms grabbed just 20% of the wind that currently blows, it could power 8 times the current global economy.
As is the case with solar, there are also technological limitations to capturing wind power as well. Large-scale wind power operations require a lot of land, as well as materials to construct the wind turbines, such as steel, concrete, and plastic, a lot of which come from non-renewable resources. And then there's the issue of what do you do with all these materials once the turbine has reached its end of lifespan and needs to be decommissioned. All of this isn't to say that small-scale wind and solar projects don't have their place, but given the intermittent nature of these power sources, it's infeasible to expect to get any sort of baseline power source out of them.
These facts are pushing the whole world to shift into the third industrial revolution. And if the first and second were spearheaded by Britain and America, it seems that the third is being spearheaded by the European Union and China. In 2017, 45% of global total investment in renewable energy was from China. China plans to get 62% of their energy from renewable sources in 30 years.
What they're not going to mention to you is that the reason China can pull this off is because China is an authoritarian country with a command economy, where the government can forcibly take resources out of the marketplace and direct it to certain other uses that are less efficient.
Europe currently gets 18% of electricity from solar and wind, but some specific countries are completely committed to pushing these numbers much further. Germany announced that over the next 20 years they are going to completely phase out coal. And in order to do this, they are going to invest $40 billion in coal cities in order to retrain workers and keep those local economies strong. And Germany has a lot of coal factories. They currently get 1/3 of their energy from coal. They understand that moving away from this energy source is going to be a huge challenge, but they realize it is an important thing to do in order to be a competitive commercial country in the future.
Germany is probably the biggest example of the failures of a 100% renewable energy policy. Germany made the idiotic decision to shut down all of their country's nuclear power plants in order to try and rely entirely on solar and wind. The result is that their country relies on more natural gas now, and CO2 emissions have actually gone up. If you want an example of a European country with good energy policies, look at France. France gets over 70% of its electricity from nuclear, and it has some of the cheapest electricity and lowest carbon emissions in all of Europe.
On top of this, 18 countries including China, India, France, the Netherlands, and Ireland have announced their intention to phase out the sale and registration of vehicles that are powered by fossil fuels over the next decade.
So instead of just letting consumers decide what cars they want to buy, let the government centrally plan that shit instead. What about people who can't afford electric cars? Or people who live in a location where there aren't a whole lot of charging stations? I guess they're just SOL.
There are still a lot of negative environmental impacts of lithium batteries.
The problem is that those negative environmental impacts caused by mining the lithium aren't really offset by the electric car. When you take into consideration all the lithium required to produce an electric car battery and all of the CO2 produced when mining that lithium, you actually end up emitting more CO2 than would be produced by a regular conventional combustion vehicle.
And with electric cars, if you are charging your car using a grid that is powered by fossil fuels, then that electric car becomes a lot less green.
A majority of America's electricity currently comes from fossil fuels, which means that if you purchase an electric car now, you're basically just purchasing a fossil fuel powered car with extra steps. Now, if our country were to switch to a mostly nuclear powered grid, nuclear power being one of the most efficient and low carbon energy sources there are, then perhaps you could make a greater argument for the reduced environmental impact of electric vehicles. Until then, though, electric cars just aren't that environmentally friendly.
This brings us to a big point of contention in these conversations, which these oil companies spend a lot of money to confuse us, me, you about.
Who exactly is it that's spending all this money? How much money are they spending, and how exactly are they trying to confuse us? You keep making this claim and keep not backing it up with an explanation.
and that is how are we going to build a grid that powers our society based on just wind, solar, and nuclear.
So again, why are those the only three options? Why are we just pretending that hydroelectric, geothermal, and biomass doesn't exist?
How do we pay for this? This is definitely an area of hot debate. I can already hear the tippity-tappities of everyone having an opinion on this, okay? That is fine. There is no correct answer right now. But after reading books and studies and listening to a lot of experts, we're gonna go over some options and talk about a few numbers.
So he says that he's going to discuss several different options for funding all of this, but he really only talks about one.
If a 70% tax were put on the super rich in America,
Of course, his solution is to steal money from people. Could have made money betting on that one. So let me ask you this. Earlier in the video, you said that renewable energy has actually become cheaper and more efficient than fossil fuels. If this is actually the case, then why wouldn't people voluntarily choose to invest in it through the marketplace? Why does it have to be forced?
it would bring in between $72 to $170 billion per year.
Which the government would blow through the entirety of in less than 2 weeks. No, I'm not kidding. Government spending really is that out of control.
This is a tax on people who make more than $10 million per year. And again, this 70% tax is only on the money that they make over $10 million.
Of course, this tax will only affect the super rich. Where have I heard that before? It's not like this tax will eventually expand to include people in lower classes or end up inadvertently impacting lower classes in some way. If you want to learn more about how taxing the rich impacts people in lower classes, check out a video by Mentis Wave. The link will be in the description.
I know that people freak out about this idea on Twitter. I think a lot of it has to do with the thought that maybe taxing these rich people is going to slow down the economy.
Well, why wouldn't it? If money is being taken out of the market and being invested in ways that are less efficient, on bloated bureaucracies and government boondoggles, instead of how people would have voluntarily chosen to make the investment, how would that not slow down the economy?
But history shows that between the 1950s and 60s, when the US had super high marginal tax rates between 70 to 92%, the actual American economy at the time was defined as having strong growth. That's kind of hot.
Of course, what he's doing here is cherry-picking one specific example of a time period where taxes were high and there was high economic growth. When you consider the data as a whole over a longer period of time, there's actually no correlation between tax rates on the wealthy and economic growth. I'll link to a video by Shin Killian that discusses this further.
Like America, okay, you need to tax the rich, okay?
I could have sworn this was a video about renewable energy. It's like they wanted to Trojan horse in a bunch of Kyle Kalinske talking points.
In 2018, 60 of America's top corporations paid $0 in federal income tax. That's insane, okay? Amazon didn't pay any federal income tax in 2018, even though they had $11.2 billion in profit. If you were an American paying taxes in 2018, you yourself paid more tax than Amazon. I know we're picking on America right now, but you do have extremely wealthy corporations and you don't seem to like to tax them.
This point is misleading because it only chooses to focus on the income tax. When you consider other taxes that corporations pay, such as corporate taxes or financial gains taxes, corporations still end up paying a majority of the taxes in America.
Zooming out to look at the world, in 2015, all fossil fuel companies received $5.3 trillion in post-tax subsidies. It is a confusing statistic, but essentially it means that your government and your tax-paying money actually had to go to funding these rich corporations.
Yeah, that's exactly how government works. They like to play favoritism with their cronies. If you think the government's ever going to take your side over big energy companies with billions of dollars, you're just simply delusional.
Okay, I need to say this now. This is a point where you can get involved. We need to be voting for politicians who are going to tax the rich.
Or, you can just get involved directly. Go ahead and donate your own money to whatever cause you deem worthwhile instead of stealing the money from other people. Hey, there's an idea.
Because the 8 richest individuals in the world have more money than half of the world combined. I don't know how else to describe this other than not cool.
Why does it matter how much money the wealthy have compared to the poor if the poor are better off as well? In capitalist countries, the average poor household has access to things like televisions and refrigerators, things that are considered luxuries in other third world countries.
We also have to vote for politicians who listen to scientists.
If politicians did listen to scientists, then they'd understand why wind and solar are just too inefficient to meet the needs of our civilization, and would be turning towards other sources like nuclear, geothermal, and hydroelectric.
and understand the environmental and economic negative impacts of continuing to subsidize fossil fuel companies.
Or how about this? Let's not subsidize any companies. Instead of stealing money out of one sector of the economy and giving it to another, how about we just let different companies in the marketplace offer their solutions and compete openly and fairly, and whoever has the best solution will win out? I don't think I have the best solution for how to balance America's energy needs with environmentalism, and for me to not only think that I do, but also want to impose it onto the rest of the country by force would be arrogant as shit.
This means voting for politicians who are open to making carbon taxes that make fossil fuels more expensive, while also rewarding green innovation.
All that's going to do is make things more expensive for working and lower classes. Like, you think inflation is bad now, wait until every single good that has to be transported over truck, rail, or ship has to be taxed.
Building out renewables is going to create new jobs, which brings us to another point of contention in these arguments and in this discussion, which is about jobs. Because if you work in the fossil fuel industry, with climate change coming and shifting the economy, you're gonna have to end up losing your job.
To start, a conservative estimate found that jobs in wind, solar, and nuclear already outnumber fossil fuel jobs by a rate of 3 to 1. But the devastating truth is that people in the fossil fuel industries will lose their jobs, which is why it's so important to help transition them, but keep them in the energy sector. These jobs might include building new batteries that are more efficient and can hold energy longer for solar and wind, or the construction of more efficient nuclear power plants.
In Canada, there's a group of oil workers called Iron and Earth who are calling on the Canadian government to help retrain laid-off oil workers to put solar panels on top of buildings, starting with public buildings like schools.
So why exactly do we need the government to do this? If the economy is naturally shifting from fossil fuels to renewables, wouldn't companies be willing to voluntarily offer this training?
In Germany, they incentivize people by subsidizing green energy and solar energy by using tax subsidies.
Germany's attempts to subsidize renewable energy like wind and solar has been a massive waste of money. As I've mentioned previously, all this did was make the country more dependent on natural gas.
This created new industries, and now a lot of early adopters are actually making money by selling energy back to the grid. In China, Hanergy is a company that leads the world in thin solar-powered material. They make backpacks and umbrellas and a range of items that allow you as an individual to carry the sun's energy with you and charge your phone. And this specific industry employs 3.8 million people. And finally, in Texas, many people have second incomes from their wind farms because Texas is windy AF. It is pretty much like the Saudi Arabia of wind.
It seems like renewables are pretty profitable on their own then if companies are willing to make these types of investments. This kind of defeats your whole argument that the government needs to step in and tax the rich and control everything.
Now let's chat COVID, as most of this information on energy is from before this current global pandemic. The pandemic has contracted the economy, which means that by the end of 2020, CO2 emissions will likely be 8% less than in 2019, a decrease of 128 gigatons of CO2 in the atmosphere compared to if there was no pandemic at all. This is the biggest annual decrease since World War II.
Yeah, and a lot of authoritarians are using this as justification for more lockdowns. If you thought the COVID lockdowns were bad, wait until people start doing climate lockdowns.
This may seem like good news, but looking at this graph of CO2 emissions, every downtick is an economic crisis.
What this should be a sign of to you is that activities that produce carbon dioxide are essential to a functioning economy, and when you try to have the government come in and artificially curtail it, it causes an economic downturn. Now, this isn't to say that we shouldn't pursue more environmentally friendly forms of energy, but rather that the transition should happen naturally and not be forced by the government.
To do this, we need to create jobs in wind and solar.
Again, what's with this whole fixation on just wind and solar? There are other types of renewable energy out there that are much more efficient, and you're choosing to focus on two of the least efficient forms of energy.
During COVID, the US, Mexico, and South Africa relaxed laws controlling pollution standards, vehicle efficiency, and even in the US, they rolled back fuel economy rules to commit the nation to higher transport emissions.
You mean they let consumers decide for themselves what they want to buy? Oh no, the horror.
Which doesn't make any sense scientifically, politically, or economically.
It actually makes perfect economic sense. During the whole COVID pandemic, the economy was on a decline, people had less money to spend, therefore something had to be done to strengthen the economy. In this case, regulations that were posing an undue burden on the industry were done away with. And besides, there's no actual proof that these regulations were doing anything to improve the environment. Countries that are more economically free actually perform better when it comes to certain environmental metrics, such as pollution, whereas countries with more government-controlled economies tend to have worse environments. The former Soviet Union, for example, currently has some of the world's most polluted lakes. This is because when the economy is controlled by the government, there's no incentive to conserve natural resources.
So get ready to vote. We will say it now and say it again. We need to vote for politicians who believe in science and who use scientific literature to build policy. This is how we catalyze political action to understand that a respect for science will protect us against the biggest threats to our societies, such as pandemics, and the biggest one that is already here and will only be getting worse in the future, and we need to be paying attention to, and that is climate change.
When the government, quote, believes in science, that's usually a euphemism for stomp on some businesses while supporting others. For example, during the whole COVID pandemic, the government believing in science meant that your small mom and pop business was considered non-essential, but Walmart gets to stay open. When the government believes in science or climate change is concerned, it means that some businesses get burdened with massive taxes and regulations while others get subsidies. And again, the point needs to be reiterated. If it really is the case that renewable energy is becoming cheaper and more efficient than fossil fuels, why do we need all this government intervention? Why wouldn't the market naturally choose to invest in renewable energy over fossil fuels? If you're someone who actually does believe in science, then what you should want is for the scientific processes to be as unbiased as possible, which means you want to get government and politics out of science. We've heard a lot about how big oil apparently spends all this money to try and deceive the public on environmental issues. What they fail to mention is that big solar and other environmental industries stand to make a lot of money off the climate hysteria too. I say let's get government, money, and politics out of science and keep it a scientific issue strictly. Until next time, this has been Philosophossum making stupidity play dead. Everyone take care.